is Genesis, foundational for understanding life and natural history. So if God created life, in fact, the Bible even says He is life, it would seem that we should first start with asking ourselves, what does God tell us? And if we go to the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 1, God tells us quite a few things. He talks about creation, and He gives us some details about creation. And this may be very interesting, reading this. God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and it was so. So we're given information about plants. God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. So we're given specific information about creation that's useful for understanding the past. Well, God tells us other things as well. One of the things He talks about is the uniqueness of humans. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. In addition to that, we're told that God provided. His provision is found at the end of Genesis chapter 1. Then God said to Adam, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and to all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. So God made an absolutely awesome creation. And then something happened. In chapter 3 of Genesis, we find that you can have everything and still not be happy because you think you're missing something. And so there was a fall. There was a curse. And that gives us a hint that even though we see a lot of design from God's creation, we also see a brokenness in the world around us because of the curse. And in fact, after the curse, humans they got so evil that eventually there was a flood. And we're given some more interesting information during the time of the flood. God's talking to Noah here. He says, you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And then after the flood was over, this goes on in Genesis 6 through 8. So in 8, after it's over, He tells Noah, bring out every kind of living creature that is with you. The birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so that they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number upon it. God gives us one more bit of information about the earth He created that is pertinent in this discussion, and it's His purpose. It's in Isaiah 45:18, and in the NIV it reads, for this is what the Lord says, He who created the heavens, He is God. He who fashioned and made the earth, He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. He says, I am the Lord, and there is no other. That's pretty profound there. Okay. Then we want to go, we've got a basis now from the Bible, and we want to go from there and look and see, what do we see in the world around us? Well, you can look in the world around us and you can see things like plants. Okay? This is a Brassica plant. It's wild cabbage. And it has a species named Brassica oleracea. And this is the same species. That's cabbage. And this is the same species, collard greens and kale and broccoli and cauliflower. I've had a few of those today. And Brussels sprouts and kohlrabi and red cabbage. That's a single species. That's quite a bit of variety there. Okay, so there's all kinds of plants we see in the world around us. These ones are very good for food. We recognize most of those. Some you may like better for food than others. The interesting thing about plants, though, is they tend to group together. So even if they aren't in the same species, you find a lot of similarities. So there's almost like this group. This is in the Brassicaceae family, and there's other plants in the Brassicaceae family that if you become familiar with one, you can often recognize another one that you don't know as being in the same family. So for example, this is also a Brassicaceae plant, as is this. So there's certain distinctive features, so these naturally group together. It had been called the crucifery family, crucifery referring to being cross-bearing, and it was called that because it has 4 petals and they're shaped kind of like a cross. It also has 6 stamens, 4 tall, 2 short. And with a lot of plant families, you find this group. Not only is the group got certain characteristics as far as how it looks, but the types of things the plants are good for are often very similar as well. Anybody recognize this? Anybody know what lamb's quarter is? It grows many places as a weed. I've known about it since my kids were little. There's a close-up of the leaf. There's it in seed. It grows in my son's garden. And so sometimes I'll eat it out of my son's garden. And it is in the same family as beets and I think spinach. It's called wild spinach. So anyhow, here you have a weed that most people think is rubbish and unwanted, and it is highly nutritious. It's got a lot of the same nutrients as spinach, and the seeds are edible as well. Chenopodium quinoa, you know what quinoa is? That grain that you spend all, well, the seeds look different from quinoa seeds. These are small, tiny, and black. But here it's in the same plant family, has a lot of the same nutrients, and it's a weed in the garden. In fact, in the last year, I have found out that not only lamb's quarter and purslane, which I knew about before, but there's hairy galansoga and mallow and it's interesting. You till the soil, and you have all these plants grow up that are edible. And then you rip them all out and put other plants in. God's provision was there right in front of our face, and we missed it. So anyhow, I go over and eat my son's weeds on a regular basis. Okay, I want to get that scripture in. This is from Job. I believe it's part of Elihu's speech. How great is God, beyond our understanding. He draws up the drops of water which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture, and abundant showers fall on mankind. This is the way he governs the nation and provides food in abundance. And that is one of several places where the Bible is clearly discussing the water cycle. It didn't start in our textbooks. It was in the Bible first. So what do we see in the world around us? Well, we see plants that bear seeds and reproduce. And there's variety. There's tremendous variety. There's food. There's provision. There's provision at times right in front of our faces. And we don't see it as provision. It's this nasty weed we have to get out of. Okay, enough of plants. There are a group of birds called passerine birds, and they're perching birds. And there's quite a bit of variety in quite a few families. So they're finches and sparrows and things like that. Now, as you look at these birds, you'll see they're all birds. They all have feathers. They all have beaks. They all have a head. They have eyes, 2 legs they stand on, wings, and tail, right? They're birds. If you look at them, you also see a lot of differences. You see differences in the size and shapes. You have different length, width, depth to the beak, different proportions to the body parts. You have one there with a crest, different color patterns, okay? So you see a lot of variety. The interesting thing is that there have been hybrids formed between each of these families. In fact, in a paper I did a number of years back, this was in the Journal of Creation, I mentioned that there's a very large sparrow finch, and we call it a monobaramin, which means these are all members of the same kind. There may be others outside the group, but a monobaramin, we know at least these are all related because we have found hybrids between these various 9 families in there. That's over 1,000 birds. That's incredible variety. Now you say, well, yeah, well, how do you know they're the same kind because they reproduce together? Well, as a veterinarian, I've had to study reproduction. And there's an amazing amount of compatibility that must be there or it doesn't work, okay? So you have a whole, all through the whole process there has to be compatibility. So you have genes coming from the father and genes coming from the mother, and they've got to be able to express themselves in the same organism in a coordinated fashion. That does not happen by accident. So when I look at reproduction, I say the only way that 2 organisms could reproduce together is if God designed them to be able to do so. And therefore, when I see animals that can reproduce with each other, I say, hey, these belong to the same kind that God created way back when. Okay, we're going to look at the dog family. We can find jackals and coyotes and, oh, what happened to that one? Somebody didn't want to show up. Maybe he'll show up at the end. We have different Ethiopian wolf, African wild dog, the crab-eating dog. We have several kinds of gray foxes. We have red foxes, Arctic foxes, fennec foxes. Look at that guy. He looks like a raccoon dog, and that. Now let's see if we can get. No, I lost a slide in there, but that's okay. You look at these guys, they're all dogs. Generally, dogs usually have long legs. There's exceptions to that. They have a face, they tend to have a bit of a muzzle. Okay, they all have fur, they all have ears. But is the fur all the same length? No. Is the fur all the same color? No. Are the ears all the same size or shape? No. So you have a difference in body proportions in that. And yet they're all in the family Canidae, and we believe that they're all part of the same created kind because the coyote, who decided not to show up on my slide, and the fox have actually hybridized. There was a zoo where they kept them together, and wow, look what we got. Okay, so when we think about what we see in the world around us, we see a lot of living creatures. They have a lot of variety in size and shape. Interesting thing about this difference in variety, one of the things it does is it adds interest and beauty. Okay, so I picked up birding, and my friend Fred took me out for a walk, and I had to stop in the middle and go see what those birds were in the tree, you know, and I pulled out binoculars out of the backpack. But there's so much beauty and variety. When I go out birding, I'm reminded of my Maker who cares for me and those birds. Okay? Now, what kind of God would create things with so much beauty? You don't have to have all those colors in birds. What kind of God would create things with so much beauty and then design us in a way that we could appreciate it. What kind of God is that? That creates beauty, enables us to enjoy it. It's a God who loves us. So, you know, this really testifies to the awesomeness of our Maker here. The other thing is some of those differences that we saw in different plants and animals had to do with adaptation. Adaptation is interesting. There's a lot of different places you can go in the world, and you know what? There's places I can take my technology, and if I take it there, it will be fried, okay? But I can go there and be okay, like water and stuff like that. You know, there are things that, there are different conditions where we adjust to those conditions, we adapt. So I was really interested in adaptation, and one of the types of adaptation that has been studied in detail is adaptation to high altitude. So this is like the front part of a paper that appeared in the Creation Research Society a few years back that talks about how endotherms, which are your birds and your mammals, okay, how birds and mammals adapt to high altitude. And it was interesting to me. Well, Denver's kind of a high city, and I have a daughter in Quito, Ecuador, which is even higher. So what goes on? Well, if you want to see how things adapt, it's really a neat, amazing, complex process. You have these immediate changes that take place, and then you have longer-term changes that can take place if you're still in the same environment, and then you can eventually have genetic changes in some cases. Even if you start a new exercise program, you have immediate and then you have longer-term changes. And if you keep exercising, you get the longer-term changes. But in the case of high-altitude adaptation, the first thing that happens is you've got this rapid pulse, rapid breathing that takes place. Well, you can't keep that up forever. So your body goes through a whole slew of changes to get to the place of where you increase the number of circulating red blood cells. Okay? Now, they did studies with beagles, and when they were raised at high altitudes, what was going on in the structure of the lungs and the way they developed differed, so they were more adapted to the high altitude. And for different populations that have lived for generations at high altitudes, we sometimes find new genetic variants, okay? Changes in the DNA. Well, when we want to go back and look at the plants and the animals and all the variety, how did this variety arise? Where does variety come from? Okay, all this difference, all this beauty and variety and adaptation and stuff like that. At creation, there's something called created heterozygosity. That means Adam, who didn't have a father or mother. I had a father and mother. So half my genes come from my father and half of them come from my mother. So for any gene, I have two copies, one from my father and one from my mother. Adam didn't have a father or mother. He still had two copies of every gene. Were they identical? Well, in some cases they may have been, but in a lot of cases they probably were not, because heterozygosity, which means they're different, the two alleles are different, they're not identical. Heterozygosity, where the two are different, is very important, and it can help in adaptation. Okay, then after that, things can get shuffled around and you can have other factors in play. If you've ever heard evolutionists claim that it is impossible for humans to have come from two individuals, you need to understand that they have an assumption that went into their calculation. The assumption is that if you had two individuals, there was zero heterozygosity. So for any gene, it was identical. Both were identical in Adam, and Eve's were identical to Adam's. Okay? If you have zero heterozygosity, then you have problems when you make calculations and get the type of diversity you see in human beings today. All you have to do to fix the problem is recognize that God created Adam with some of those genes being different. You know, he has two copies. So they weren't identical. Okay, and then you have a sorting and shuffling that can go on from there. But there's other things that can happen. You can actually get DNA sequence changes, which are called mutations. There's different types. You have Times where you just change the nucleotide, so it's like changing the letter of the DNA. You have times where you can cut a piece out, or put a piece in, or take a piece, cut it out, and turn it around and put it back in. You have lots of types of changes that can take place. Now, how do you know if something's created heterozygosity, or a created allele, or something that came about by mutation? Well, it can be difficult. Sometimes you just don't know. But there are ways we can kind of tell. If you have both parents and you sequence their DNA, and you have a child and you sequence the child's DNA, and you find the child is different in a particular location, you know that that difference arose by mutation. They did not receive it from their parents. Well, it's great when you can do that, but a lot of times you can't. Less common alleles are one way we know. For example, in human beings, we have many human beings, and a lot of things, a lot of the diversity within human beings is there across different nations, people from different places all around the world. But sometimes you'll find an allele, or it's a copy of the gene that is different, and it's only found in a small group of people. You're almost guaranteed that's a mutation. Why? Because as people spread out from the flood, the common ones would have gone, the common alleles would go way back and probably be created. The less common ones showed up more recently, and that's why not as many people carry them, and it's just found in a small population. Okay. The other thing I do all the time, let's go back. How many animals were on the ark in the flood?
An even number.
Yeah, it was 2 for all the unclean animals. For the unclean animals, it was 2, and that was land animals, and it was the flying animals. Okay? It was 2 for the unclean animals. So I had looked in dogs, and it's like, hey, wait a minute. You have 7 or 8 different versions of this gene in dogs alone. So you know many of those had to have arisen after the flood. So we have 2 ways that variety can be there. It could have been created by God, and some was, or it can show up later. Now, if some of you, wherever, I don't know where you went to school or what you think, but I'm always running into people where their definition of mutation is it's an accident, because you will have people tell you it's a mutation. That means it's a copying error. It's an accident that never got repaired. It's something bad, bad, bad. Okay? Well, if you look up the definition, most definitions do not say what causes it. It just says what it is. So mutation is defined as a change in the DNA sequence. That is the way I always use it. So if I make the change in the DNA sequence, I have made a mutation. I've changed the DNA sequence. DNA editing is well known to occur. Now, nowadays they are using a system they found out bacteria have to edit DNA, and they're using that to try to cure diseases by editing DNA. Okay, there's a defective gene in a person. We're going to see if we can edit the DNA and fix that gene, or maybe insert a gene that will take care of that's a corrected gene and put it in. But DNA editing was invented by God. In fact, we've copied off him. It occurs during meiosis. Meiosis is that cell division where you get germ cells for the next generation. If you didn't have DNA editing, you would not be able to have kids, and you never would have been born yourself. DNA editing is essential, and it's called homologous recombination if you study biology. It involves things like crossing over and gene conversion. It requires a specific enzyme to cut the DNA, other enzymes to manipulate the DNA as appropriate, and then enzymes to stitch it together. Your body was designed to do that. If you don't do that, if your body can't do that, you won't have any kids. If your parents' bodies couldn't do that, you wouldn't be born. So it's essential for life. There's a second place where DNA editing goes on, and that's in antibodies. These are within specific cells within your body, and they're called B cells. Okay? And what happens is the DNA in the B cells is actually edited. There's 4 types. Okay, this thing's going crazy. There's 4 types: gene conversion, in antibody formation occurs in the chicken. It does about the same thing as VDJ recombination. There's specific enzymes that start the process, and it recruits specific other things to continue the process. These two are involved as well. You don't need to know a lot of detail about it, but the idea is if you couldn't edit DNA, if your body didn't have the right enzymes to go in, cut the DNA, change the DNA appropriately, and stitch it back together the right way, you would not be alive today. DNA editing is something that God designed, and life could not exist without it. So much for DNA changes always being accidents. So one of the things that happens is you find that new genetic variants seem to arise, and they're adaptive, and that's great, like for high altitudes. Well, how do they show up in a timely fashion? How do they show up before everything dies out? You know, if you have natural selection but there's nothing left, it's not called natural selection anymore, it's just extinction. Okay, so how do genetic variants show up at the right time in the right place? I am convinced that DNA editing is involved in that as well. It's just not expected, and we haven't researched it enough to find it. The other thing is changing DNA is not easy to change back. It's a very committed change. So you're not going to change it lightly. Okay, at this point it's like, wait a minute, we're talking about these things changing all the time. Isn't that evolution? Well, evolution is a very confusing word, and I think some people like to keep it that way. Evolution has multiple definitions, and so whether or not I believe in evolution depends on which definition you're using. So if someone asks me, do you believe in evolution, it's like, would you explain to me the definition you're going by? Okay? Because one of the definitions of evolution is change in the allele frequency over time. Okay? The alleles are those little genes, right? The type things. So when the Grants studied finches on the Galapagos, they noticed that the average beak size changed. And underlying that would have been certain alleles. So sure, things change over time. Okay? It's a common occurrence. No one denies that. No one who's really thinking denies that. Okay? It really doesn't support universal common ancestry because nothing's changing into something fundamentally different. And in fact, you will find that the diversification and adaptation that has occurred since God created life and as it filled the earth requires pre-existing complexity. Now that's a problem for the evolutionists because they're supposed to go simple to complex. No, you start with complex and then you can adapt. You don't have that complexity there, you can't adapt. You have networks that were designed to allow for change. There's redundancy in there, which means if you lose something, there are often another part of the system that can take over that job. Okay, so there's networks that were designed to allow for change. There's design mechanisms, particular enzymes. That's the name of one enzyme that's involved in the immune system. Design mechanisms for making the changes. We don't know what they are, except for the ones that I mentioned already. Design mechanisms for increasing allele frequency? Maybe. There's something called meiotic drive, and all that is instead of you're getting alleles from your parents in a typical Mendelian fashion, one allele is preferentially done over the other. So when you have gene conversion, you preferentially convert it one direction, which means there's more of that there. That's gene conversion is one form of meiotic drive. So there are things besides natural selection that can increase allele frequency. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about created kinds. We usually call them baramins. Baramins, bara means to create, and min means kind in Hebrew. Now evolutionists see the similarity and infer that it continues to universal common ancestry. So if things can change, then things can just keep changing forever, is the belief they have. Okay? But in the Bible, we read the verses that said that God created life as distinct kinds. which rules out universal common ancestry. We have very limited common ancestry. There's some common ancestry, but it's limited. If this is true, what the Bible says about things being created according to their kind, life, we would expect to see clustering or grouping among organisms. All right, this is Eric Vossman. Look at the year he was born. Anybody recognize that?
Origin of Species.
It was the year the Origin of Species came out. He was a famous entomologist. He was also a Jesuit. Okay, he argued against species fixity. What happened is when Darwin argued for his view, he contrasted it to species fixity. Species don't change, okay? And Vossman said, well, of course they do. And that was called evolution. So, of course he believed in evolution because species change. Remember, there's more than one definition. Okay, so that's the way Vossman was viewing it. But Vossman did not believe in universal common ancestry. This is, this is a comment he made. He said, all honest supporters of the theory of evolution who pay due attention to the facts acknowledge further that the grounds for assuming the existence of a real relationship between the forms in question becomes more scanty when higher divisions are considered. For the species of one genus, these grounds are often amount to great and even irrefutable probability. And the same may be said for not a few cases of genera in one family, and occasionally for families in one order, but it can seldom be maintained for orders in one class. The evidence afforded by natural science for the theory of common descent becomes steadily weaker the higher we ascend the system. Do you catch what he's saying? He's saying, yeah, at lower levels things do group really well, and we can make very good arguments that they're related. You go higher up, and in some cases you can. You go very high, and you can't. It's unreasonable. And the evolutionists will say, oh, he believes in evolution. And he's called sometimes a theistic evolutionist, but that's not really fair. His view is very close to a young earth creationist view as far as how he views kinds. He doesn't call them kinds, but that you can tell from he's talking about that. So evidence continues to mount today. In fact, evolutionists must assume massive gene gains followed by massive losses to account for higher order taxa. That would be your kingdom, your phylum, your class, and often order. So all this, somewhere in history there was this sudden increase in the number of genes. How do you do that? By random chance processes and natural selection. And then this loss. Okay, well, that tells you there's significant differences between these groups. The differences between these groups are far more likely to be created differences. The reason why there's a whole different array of genes when you go higher up is because they aren't actually related. They were created differently. Okay. We use statistical methods to show these clusters. Todd Wood has used a number of methods, if you're familiar with his work. This is one, that shows up better than the last time I did it. This is one that we did recently with a project we're working at the Creation Research Society. This is Diptera, which is an order of insects. And you have mosquitoes, and you have flies. So here, you notice the comparison was done on proteins. So we are taking all the known proteins for any particular organism, and we're comparing doing an all versus all comparison. So you see this really white spot here? This is where this organism is compared to itself, and its name would be down here too. This is this organism compared to itself, okay? So the really white ones in this are how it looks when they are really similar. And dark means they're dissimilar. A lot of the proteins that are very different, they don't have the same types of proteins. You notice there's two rather white squares here? I'll outline them for you. Okay, that's Nematocera. That is your mosquitoes. These are all your different mosquitoes there. This is Brachiocera. This is your fruit flies, your stable flies, your house flies, etc. Now, there were a few others that should have shown up in one of these groups, but they didn't. What we found is you had to have a very complete set of proteins or you don't get nice clusters. They don't cluster well. You have to have a very complete set of proteins. See this group that's a little darker here? They were kind of on the edge. So these were really low in the number of proteins we had, the number of orthologs we found, which are the proteins that match. These were kind of low, but still they showed up in the right group. So this order has two distinct groups in it. Here's another interesting one. Oh, this one didn't show up as well as I'd like. But, okay, look at the white. Look at this white. This white is rather large. And then there's a white down here. So I will go ahead and circle them. That's human beings, okay? So Homo sapiens, you recognize that? Denisova. They found the finger of some dude, and it was really old, and so it was, I think, before modern humans, and they called them Denisovans. They're humans. It was a human finger. So they apparently got information from them. And Neanderthals, maybe you've heard of them. They're human. It's the same thing. See how white it is? Okay, now this group here is the rest of your primates. And so we have a few different things in here. You have monkeys, and you have other primates like your lemurs and your ii and things like that. Those are the lemurs and ii. This slide isn't showing. These are a little darker. This is a bad background. But this here is really white. And why didn't it do the top of? I don't know why the top didn't show. The top goes here. Okay. So this is the ones that really are nice and white compared to that. We have Old World monkeys. We have great apes, and we have New World monkeys. Now, are we constantly told that gorillas and chimpanzees are closely related to human beings, right? We're constantly hounded with that. Oh, we're so similar. Oh, we're so similar. Well, don't great apes look a lot like a tailless monkey? Yeah, they do, actually. So is it really so surprising to find that great apes are right here in the middle between Old World and New World monkeys? They do not group with human beings. Remember that God created humans distinct and separate? Well, you see that in the proteins we have. And in fact, there's another article that shows about the same thing. I had Jeff Tompkins of ICR write an article for our spring genetics issue that came out for 2 years ago. It would be 2016. There are many genes in human beings that are very different from other vertebrates. So in all vertebrates, they have this gene, and it's very similar among all other vertebrates, your mammals and your birds, and sometimes even more than vertebrates. So throughout history, supposedly this gene hardly changed at all, and then boom, it's dramatically different in human beings. So how do you explain that if you assume human beings are related to everything else? It's like all of a sudden there's this accelerated evolution. And they didn't observe that. They're assuming that because they're assuming they're related. So anyhow, there's a whole bunch of them. There's many genes in us that are very distinctly different from all other animals. It's okay, compared to all genes, it's a small fraction, but there's still a lot of them. So this is the Creation Research Society's research initiative that this research was part of. It's called Examination of Kinds in Natural Diversification and Speciation. So we want to understand kinds and a little bit about their natural history. This thing is really being hard on me. Okay, how did we get the wide variety of today's species from a small number of animals preserved on the ark? How do new species form, and how does it fit within biblical creation? And can we trace the spread of different Brahmins from the ark to where they live today? Okay, these are the types of questions we're trying to answer. Yes, we are looking for funding, and yes, we could use your prayers. All right. So, they didn't give me a clock, so I have no idea how I'm doing time. All right, so when we look at creation and evolution, they both recognize that things do change over time, but there are some fundamental differences. In creation, you have adaptive changes. Why? Well, you'd expect adaptive changes because God's intent was that the earth would be inhabited. So as they reproduced and filled the earth, they needed to adapt, and He made it so they could adapt. And there's a physiologic adaptation, and then there's the genetic adaptation we talked about as well. A lot of the changes are degenerative, and there's a couple reasons why that. One, the curse causes, there are times where mutations are accidents. That does occur. Okay? And so, with the curse, things are broken. And you do see that brokenness in the world. But the other thing is you have this complexity that was designed so you could take advantage of the complexity and adapt. And on a biochemical level, you have degenerative, it breaks down it breaks down the system. It doesn't build it up. So for example, you have black cattle. The black cattle are black because the pigment cell has a broken receptor on the outside, and it's turned on all the time. It's like a receptor's like a switch. Turns it on and off, right? The switch is stuck in the on position, and you always get the black, okay, produced. If it was stuck in the off position, like in an Irish setter, you get red. Why? Because that's the lighter pigment, and that's what happens when you don't flip the switch on. So you find that that's degenerative. You have this receptor that's sitting on the outside of your pigment cell, and the normal signal to turn it on and off isn't being received. You've stuck it in the on position, or you broke it so it's always off. Okay? So even adaptive changes on the molecular level can be degenerative. They don't build things up. They can tune things, shift it this way or shift it that, or they can break things. Okay, so that is what we see in the world. If you're going to believe in evolution, and I will define evolution here, since we better do that. This is universal common ancestry evolution. This is biblical creation. Okay? The overall trend must be upward. Why? Because you aren't just changing the size and the shape of a beak on a finch. You have to put the beak on the finch, and then you have to put the beak on a finch in a way so you can change its size and shape. Good luck with that. Okay, so you know, and they have to put the feet on the bird and the eyes and the head on the bird, and you're starting from like a single cell whatever. You have to put the hair on the dog. You have to put the ability for changes to occur that'll change what we... hit the wrong button. The overall trend must be upward. Doesn't mean you can't go other directions. It means the noticeable overall trend must be upward. That is not what we see at all. Okay, and then how do these changes occur? That's the second question. Okay, let's get the right thing here. In a biblical view, you have a designer, and he designed his creatures to reproduce and fill the earth because it was his intent that the earth would be inhabited. So there are systems designed for change. In other words, you have this redundancy. You have the ability to change something without breaking everything and killing the organism. Okay? Things were designed so they could change. Let's get the right button. And there are designed mechanisms for making the change. So there are enzymes necessary to do DNA editing, I am convinced, for a lot of these changes that go beyond the ones that are just in the immune system. But if you're an evolutionist and you really kind of don't believe in God and everything has a common ancestor, you not only need this upward trend, which we don't see, but your changes are accidental chance changes to DNA. Okay? And all you've got is natural selection to work on it. You know? Let's see a few words about natural selection here. The Grants studied finches in the Galapagos, and they wrote a book on it, and I'm working on a book review for that right now. It's amazing what natural selection can do, right? It removes things. So if you have variety, it'll remove some of the variety. Okay, so you had these medium ground finches that had a variety of sizes of beaks. Some were bigger, some were smaller. And the smaller beaked birds ate the smaller, softer seeds, and the bigger beaked birds could eat the bigger seeds. So what happened? Well, they didn't notice natural selection in most years, but then all of a sudden there was this drought. And the one drought, small seeds disappeared first. Guess what happened to the small beaked birds? They died. Okay. Yeah. So what's natural selection doing? Well, it's killing off part of your birds. And then the next year when the rains came back, what happened? Well, the seeds came back. Where are your birds? Yeah, they're dead. They're gone. That natural selection removed healthy variety from that population. Now, through hybridization with closely related species, some of that was regained. The other thing natural selection can do is kind of push things apart. So if there's a lot of variety and there's overlap, natural selection can get rid of some of that variety, and it can make things diverge. And in that sense, it kind of can make new species, because if you can tell these populations apart consistently, we can call them a new species, because they're diagnosably different. That's what a different species is. It's something diagnosably different. If you saw an individual from it, you could, correctly pinpoint which group it belongs to. So natural selection does shape things, but that doesn't mean natural selection shapes things in a way that benefits the animal. And evolutionists and sometimes creationists are horrible at this, as they'll say, this adaptation was a result of natural selection. It's never true. So let's say there's this bird with a longer beak, and then with a longer beak, it can get into the cactus flower and get nectar out. Okay, so that's a good adaptation. It's really well adapted. Does natural selection explain where that long beak came from? No. Now it may explain why some of the shorter beaked birds aren't there anymore. Maybe you killed them off. But it doesn't explain how you got the long beak. And so it's almost this sleight of hand. It explains how you get rid of things. It can explain why instead of there being overlap, there now is separation, because natural selection removed some of the variety in the middle. So it can do those kind of things, but it only removes things. It never explains adaptation. It can explain why you don't have, sometimes it can explain why you don't have other traits around. So natural selection, does it exist? Well, yeah, but it doesn't do what it's normally claimed to do. And in fact, if you look at the book, the Grants book, you find that natural selection played the villain in several places, and it was hybridization with other species that played the hero. All right. My voice is going quickly here. I love looking at the natural world because everything about it points to a designer, points to its maker. And in Psalm 104:24 it says, "O Lord, how manifold are your works! In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." God is the source of life. God provides life for all. And He doesn't just provide existence. He provides abundant life. He designed beauty. He gave us the ability to enjoy it. And so I think it would be appropriate if I get you guys to maybe stand up if you're able. And I was going to try to sing a hymn with you. And I hope you have good voices, because mine's about gone. I will see if I can do this. I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise, that spread the flowing seas abroad, and built the lofty skies. I sing the wisdom that ordained the sun to rule the day. The moon shines full at His command, and all the stars obey. I sing the goodness of the Lord, who filled the earth with food, who formed the creatures through the word, and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed where'er I turn my eye. If I survey the ground I tread, or gaze upon the sky, there's not a plant or flower below, but makes thy glories known. And clouds arise and tempests blow by order from thy throne. While all that borrows life from thee is ever in thy care, and everywhere that man can be, thou God art present there. And I want to give us all a minute to just ponder the awesome work of God. That's our Maker. But because of the fall, our sins have separated us from God. And God wasn't happy with that. He wants us to belong to Him. And as human beings, every last one of us has rebelled against God. But God, through Christ, has given us the option of being His child. And if you don't know Him today, I want you to consider that God who gave you breath, the God who keeps your heart beating, the God that created beauty and gave you the ability to enjoy it, the God who provides food for you, He wants you to belong to Him. When we go our own way, we just break things. And so if you've been wandering off, maybe you know Him and you've been wandering off, or maybe you don't know Him at all, I want to encourage you in this time to commit your heart to your Maker and follow the one who created you and get to know Him. So we're going to close in prayer. Lord, there was a lot of stuff we hit tonight. Some of it got a little technical. But I pray, Lord, that you would help each one of us go away with the things that you intended for us to have from this meeting. And I pray, if anything, that our hearts would just delight in you. When we see your creation, Lord, that we would delight in you, the God who loves us, the God who provides, our Creator. May your name forever be praised. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Short, fat, old local dentist. I may not have been tracking with you fully when you were talking about how maybe allele expression was sort of a just-in-time kind of thing in a new environment, or in an environmental stress. I'm not sure I quite tracked with you.
Let's say you have a population at a high altitude, and there are human populations and animal populations at high altitudes. Well, it's stressful to live at a high altitude, and even though you can change physiologically, it is still stressful. And many of those populations have a mutation that will adjust things. In animals, it tends to be in the hemoglobin gene, and it just shifts the hemoglobin so it has a different affinity for the oxygen. It binds it more or less strongly. Okay.
Is it a new expression for the same alleles, or
no, it's actually it's a new allele because it's a different DNA, a change in the DNA, and so I'm getting tired here. So yeah, the problem with these adaptive things is they show up really quickly. So if somebody was telling me, I think it was a lunch conversation, that in a cave they had, I think, what was it, a trout, I think he said it was, and they'd been in there in 2 generations, they lost their sight. Well, that's a really quick change, and they did adapt to the environment. There are reasons why it's an advantage to lose your sight if you're stuck in a cave for generations. Now, if you're just visiting, of course you don't want to do that. The stickleback fish will lose their spines if they get caught in a freshwater environment. That happens within 50 years, they know. Okay, these things happen quick. Well, how do you? And they know that's a mutation too. It basically knocks something out. So how do you do it that quickly? If you wait around for random whatever, you're going to be waiting for a long time. Things have to show up in the right place at the right time. And I think in the young Earth time frame, that's more obvious to us. That evolutionists just assume more time and don't think about it. Okay, and so and that is why I am proposing that DNA editing goes beyond just the stuff in meiosis where there's crossing over and gene conversion, and beyond what we know already exists in the immune system. And the DNA editing goes on in other circumstances to help animals and people adapt, and plants.
So it's a creative process, not just a conservative process.
It kind of. Yeah, well, when you form antibodies, technically it's something new. Now you have an antibody to something you haven't had one before. So it's new, but the programming had to have been in there. God had to design it so that could take place. And I'm assuming he's not working a miracle every time. I'm assuming he's designed it so that's what happens.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
Gene.
Hi.
I'm Phil Budd, and I'm on CRSNet, and
Yeah, I
appreciate that. I have a friend who, her father is alcoholic, and there are 12 children in the family. So all 7 boys are alcoholic, and all 7 girls are not. So I presume that is passed down by the Y chromosome. And there's no mediation of some kind in any of their other genome.
It's interesting because with something like alcoholism, there's a strong peer pressure type influence. There's a strong influence that way. I can't remember if there's genes that predispose it. So, I mean, there's some people that can quite naturally take alcohol in a very limited fashion and they never get drunk. There are cultures that do that. But I think a lot of it is more social context. I think the social context is probably the much more heavier in influence in that case. And it doesn't mean there's no choice, but it means that there's a lot of pressure that tends to push that direction.
I know a lot of the men's diseases that women don't get, they say are connected.
Sometimes.
For example, you on the double helix or whatever, you have 2 X chromosomes. Normally, if you have a problem on one of them, the other one will take over, as you were talking about in your speech.
Yeah.
But in the Y chromosome, why does that not occur?
Yeah, there's no extra copy.
No extra copy.
That's
At
the way
least,
it is.
is that on the entire Y chromosome, or is it just on
There's a few parts of the Y chromosome that I think are similar to the X. Oh my, this is a Rob Carter question, not a Gene Lightner question. In fact, that mitochondrial one was a Rob Carter. He would have had something comment on that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. I think there are like 15 to 17 alleles on the male chromosome that have no.
Yeah, there's a fair amount that doesn't have any counterpart on anything else. Yes,
okay.
That's correct. And the other thing, just to bring it up, they have sequenced the human Y chromosome and the chimp Y chromosome, and they are so dramatically different, it's ridiculous. Yes, and you can go and you can look at pictures that show they just are not. They're not the same at all. They aren't similar, except that they're with the Y chromosome. Yeah. So anyhow, thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Jean.
Yeah.
What about the female and the chimp X chromosome? That's just begging the question.
Well, I don't. Okay. You find that I, as the veterinarian, play with all the animals, and that Rob Carter, who he's on the Creation Research Society board and he works for CMI, he does the human stuff. So I really don't know. I'm not used to a whole lot of comparisons between humans and chimps. I look at the comparisons and I say, man, you know, you're assuming humans and chimps are closely related, and then they're the only two you're comparing, and then you're saying, well, look at the similarity. Yeah, well, I could pick a different pair and say, look at the similarity. I can look at the similarity between me and the bird. We're both bipedal, 2 feet. Anyhow. Yeah. And obviously, the chimps would be more similar than the birds, but so I don't follow that stuff. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Pete from Colorado Springs. Could you just tell us how you became a creationist?
Well, that's a good question. Like it said in the announcement, I always enjoyed the biological world. I was told by, I think it was my brother, when I was maybe 9th grade, that evolution conflicted with the Bible. I think I had this book on horses, and I was looking at horse evolution, and that evolution conflicted with the Bible. And so I had a Christian faith, and I love biology, and then there was this tension there. 10th grade wasn't bad because they said, oh, look at the similarity. And it's like, well, the similarity can be there for more than one reason. That is not an impressive argument. Okay, but then I went to college, and you are taking your biology wasn't that bad, zoology and all that. Oh, there's all this evidence for evolution. Oh, there's all this evidence. Well, sure, if you just change over time, but I was looking for something to turn into something fundamentally different, and I never saw it, and so there was no evidence for things changing into something fundamentally different. But anyhow, I realized how, if I'm not going to take God seriously in the book of Genesis, it's hard to take him seriously other places. So if he says, I have to forgive my brother, and I'm not feeling like forgiving my brother, and I make excuses in Genesis, then it's really easy to make excuses in other places. And so I was either going to live a Christian life or not, and if God couldn't tell me if God can express him, he's the creator of communication, right? If the creator of communication cannot communicate to me in a way I can understand, then how do you trust him? So, and I just realized that it was a critical issue, and I struggled with my faith for a while on it. When I give talks, I've given talks down in Ecuador at the school my youngest daughter teaches at, and one of the things I tell the students, because I realize they're young, I say, you know what? You're going to have doubts. I guarantee the doubts will come, but when you do, choose to obey God. Because I remember the enemy just screaming at me, you don't want to do that, you'll look stupid, God isn't real. And in that moment, I felt like God was not real. That's how great the doubts were. And then I asked myself, I said, it's like God isn't real. Why am I doing this? I'm just embarrassing myself. And then I said, yeah, but if God is real, I want to please him. So I'm going to do it anyhow. And so with that raging doubt inside, I acted in faith instead of listening to the doubts. And I went and followed through and was obedient. And that was extremely important, because the answers to questions that I did not have answers to came after I was willing to be obedient. And I think that that's something that's critical in young people. If I don't understand, I am still going to follow God, and I'm going to be obedient. And if today I don't even feel like he exists, too bad. If he does exist, I want him to be pleased, so I'm going to do it anyhow. You know. And so that, to me, that obedience was an important factor in bringing my faith to where it needed to be and dealing with this evolution stuff I was inundated with in college. So. Oh, here's somebody.
You sort of took a little bit of steam out of what I was going to ask you. I've always been concerned, I guess all of life is basically chemicals, okay? I have been concerned about the degradation of the human species and perhaps the animal species and plant species. In that nowadays we are given so many chemicals in the form of medicines, certainly in veterinary medicine it's the same way, and we try to cover symptoms and correct illnesses and things like that. Do you notice in the animal world, and maybe it can be applied to the human world, because I'm in caregiving, and so I'm concerned about, you know, diseases and dementia and that kind of thing that occurs so often in seniors. But I have this theory, is it possible that all the chemicals that we consume, all the artificial chemicals, rather than food sources, we're taking supplements, we're doing the medicines, and you could answer maybe in the animal world, and maybe we could apply it to the human world. Do you think that that is contributing to mutations that are not good for us, consuming all these chemicals?
Well, there are certainly some chemicals that have done that and have been shown to do that. I think you have to be careful to make not to make too broad a generalization. Are there some chemicals that can do that? Yeah, we know there's some chemicals to do that. I think sometimes there's this fear of all chemicals. There's a lot we don't know, and it's a complex question. We were designed in ways to be able to process some things that shouldn't be in the body. Our livers detoxify and things like that. They have to. But there is very good reason for caution with chemicals. I will put it that way. But there's very good reason for caution with a number of things that maybe aren't quite chemicals either. Chemicals probably contribute to some degree. Mutations, some of them probably are other pressures. You could have environmental pressures. There is cold stress, there is heat stress, and they can do things to animals. So there's a variety of environmental influences that can affect things. And yeah, sometimes some mutations, even if they're adaptive in a certain circumstance, may not be beneficial in another place. So you have to be, there's a lot going on. We don't know it all. Okay.
Almost done. Does anybody have any more questions? Because if not, I will ask my question, which probably is a lesser question than everybody else's.
It will take longer to answer.
Yeah, probably.
Probably both, yes. So here's my question, and I'll try to formulate it as I talk about it. But you were talking about the DNA editing, and the fact that mutations are not just bad things; they're just changes.
Yeah, some of them may be bad, but yeah, they aren't necessarily bad.
Well, that's actually my question. Is up until you said that, I had been under the impression that I was in that group that you were talking about that thought all mutations are just bad.
So was I 20 years ago.
So I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit more, maybe give an example or something of each. What would be a God-given DNA editing process as opposed to gamma ray damaging a reproductive gene of some kind.
Okay, that gets really sticky.
Well, I mean, don't go into too much detail, just enough so that you can get a feel, because I have this picture in my mind that from a speaker we had a long time ago, and I have no doubt it was right. It's just, the image that I have. He was showing how these mutations all stack up on the bad side of things, in the sense of degrading the population.
Oh, okay.
And that sort of goes to the whole idea of this book. I think it's called Genetic Entropy.
It's John Sanford's book. Yeah,
and
I can
so
talk
if
a
you
little
can
bit to that.
just kind of comment on all that is really, maybe add a little more definition to it.
Okay, John Sanford probably had a graph, or at least Rob Carter actually works with Sanford a lot. And so you have the neutral little bar going up, okay? And so most of your mutations are near neutral, and then they trail out to the bad side, okay? And I think that's fairly fair. It's somewhat theoretical because the vast majority of mutations we haven't even really characterized. So some of it comes from a theoretical background. But that seems to be pretty much the case, and I don't have a problem with that. I think it's probably true. But why are most of them near neutral? You have a very complex system here. Why are most of them so close to neutral?
Are they being repaired?
No, they aren't a mutation if they don't have the DNA change. If you change it back to what it was and it's repaired, it's no longer it's not a mutation, because you can't see a difference between whatever was there before and what you've got now. So anyhow, why are most of the mutations near neutral? Now, what happened historically, when we first learned about bacteria, we learned about them because of disease, because disease is important and we study it. And when my grandmother was around, the only good bacterium was a dead one. And we know now that that's not true, that most bacteria are good and there's a few that are bad, and we don't want to wipe out all the good with the bad and stuff like that. That's the way research went. Mutations went a lot like that. So as in veterinary medicine, I only knew about the mutations that were bad, right? They caused these horrible diseases. So it was really not even on my radar that they could be adaptive. So John uses that thing. John and I agree that you are not building up the genome. We agree that it is going from a state of complexity and it's being degenerated. We might disagree with how fast that's occurring, but we agree with the general overall trend, okay? But why are most of them near neutral? That doesn't make sense. We have an extremely complex system. Why aren't most of them really bad? Whoops. I mean really bad. Why aren't most of them really bad? Why are so many near neutral? Well, your adaptive mutations are probably near neutral. Why? Because a lot of them don't, a lot of them we are not able to perceive a lot of change. And a lot of them, whether they're good or bad, depends on your environment. So, and they are, well, the ones that are not near neutral are ones like, what did I say earlier? Sickle cell. Sickle cell's not near neutral. Even though it benefits in certain limited conditions, it's not really near neutral. So that, how do you tell? So the question is, a sickle cell, there's actually a couple of them. Was that a God-given rescuing thing for people who were living in those horrible conditions? Maybe. As bad as it is for people to have that mutation, because it gave them an advantage in a place that would otherwise be uninhabitable, it's possible that there's a directed component to it. Okay, even though we don't think of it as good. Okay, so, but it was just a very costly mutation. So sometimes to adapt, you lose something. It's costly. I'm hoping that explains it fairly well. John's a good man. I like him. I've worked well with him. He's benefited me. We've had good conversations. But, and this is what John is doing. John is taking, he's modeling stuff, and he's modeling things within the evolutionary side. Remember I had two sides over there? He's modeling things from the evolutionary side. So he's taking some of their assumptions, and he knows he is, and he's modeling things and showing how it's degrading things. And I had a conversation with him once, and he says, oh, so you think there's directed mutations? And I said, yeah, I think so. And he says, I don't have a problem with that. I said, but I have no idea how you'd model that. So he is working within the evolutionist framework to show the evolutionists your paradigm doesn't work. Do you understand what he's doing? Okay, that's not what I'm doing. So John and I are not at odds with each other, but we are looking at things differently. And if you miss that, you might think it sounds like we're at odds with you. We aren't. We're just looking at things differently.
So, Gene, is one of the reasons why a single mutation doesn't have a bigger impact on a species? Because in order to do a big impact that survives in a healthy way, you have to do more than the change you could do at one gene?
Okay, it's really interesting how God set things up, because for some traits you can change one gene a little bit and you can get a dramatic effect. Okay. And then there's other times where you change a lot of genes. What was it? You can get, there's a gene in Holstein cattle that will give them high butter fat. But there's a different cow, I can't remember for sure if it's Guernsey, it's one of, no, it's a Jersey, I think. The Jersey has a bunch of genes that work together why she produces high dairy fat. So it's the same trait, but in one case you have one gene with a big effect, and in the other case you have a bunch of genes with a much smaller effect. So it's interesting how God designed things. There's a lot of... So and there's some genes, you put a mutation in it, and you got a dead organism. That's the end. So only certain places can handle that kind of change. Yeah. We done?
Yeah, that's my question. Anybody have any more quick questions? All right. Well, I guess we will wrap things up then. Thank you, Dr. Lightner.
Thank you for having me.